start my presentation. Okay. Yeah, so today I'll be presenting on molecule language multimodality. And this is going to be a little bit of a mix of a tutorial I given earlier in the year and my own research. So kind of a question we were asked, kind of have been asking, right, is how can we increase AI model understanding of biology, chemistry, etc. And so one way to do this, right, is to increase our understanding of the inherent properties of molecules, proteins, peptides, things like that, from like how they interact with each other, how they are structured, how they're composed of different, let's say, atoms or different kind of motifs, things like that. But there's also centuries of work that has been collected by generations of scientists. And this is kind of an important source of information for improving our models. So kind of looking at this specifically, how do we use this natural language then for these kind of specific domains? Well, one thing that I think is kind of pretty conspicuous, people have been thinking about it for a while, is just extracting and aggregating information across scientific documents. However, kind of within recent years, there's been this sort of new idea of using natural language as a method for controlling molecule discovery. And so here I plan to focus on two, since it's like a newly developing field. So kind of a key idea that I want to get across here, right, is that molecules are essentially a language. So we can represent molecules in different ways, much in the same way that we can represent semantic ideas from human language in different ways. And this generally applies to many different classes of molecules, whether it's small molecules or peptides or proteins or DNA, etc. So first here, I'm going to show a little bit of background on just using language models then with this, like, perhaps most natural language, right? Since it's a language essentially that nature has come up with, um, and how we're using language models to help design things. So these are kind of background work that I wanted to go through. But basically, yeah, the idea is, okay, we have these breakthroughs in language modeling and we've applied them to the language of molecules. So in many cases here, the kind of, at least initial work, is really just taking ideas from natural language processing and applying it to these molecular representations. But there's also opportunities for other types of ways of training the model, right? So instead of only doing masked language modeling, you can also predict specific molecular properties, et cetera. Kind of as another thing is that because these models are very good at generating kind of new things, right? That's kind of a big draw to them. They also can be quite useful for generating molecules. And so you can use an autoregressive model to do that. Kind of interestingly, you can condition on specific properties that may be of interest, right? Also, something I wanted to mention, so this is one of my own papers, is that transformers can actually be useful at higher levels too. So, for example, here we looked at learning how to predict drug synergy in context. And so it's essentially a higher level interaction between these molecules that's taking place in a very complex environment, which is different cell types within the human body. Right. And of course, the goal there is to help address drug resistance and increase drug efficacy. And we want to essentially be able to do this in-context prediction using very limited data on, for example, let's say you biopsy a patient tumor and are able to construct a data set of maybe 10 to 20, or you come up with a new drug and you can only do a few experiments in the lab. Okay, but let's look at the main focus, which is really integrating natural language with molecules. So here, the first thing we should ask is, what does natural language have to offer? Um, so I'm sort of going to go through a few high-level directions that, as a kind of, we're generally interested in. Um, so the first one, of course, is generative modeling. Right, this has become quite a popular paradigm just in general natural language processing in the last couple years. But kind of the really interesting thing here is that a big so-called problem with current language models, right, hallucination, is actually a strength when we want to discover new molecules. In particular, the focus there is on high-level functions, abstract properties, and composition of many properties. So on the right, you can see an example of a text-to-image model where um, DALL-E 3 is able to take all these ideas from this description and put them together. And it might not have ever seen anything like that before, but it's seen all the individual pieces, and so it's able to compose them. And so that's sort of really a goal, right? Can we get to that level of performance, but can we do it with molecules instead of images? Okay, as another sort of really interesting potential application here is bridging modalities. So kind of a big problem in AI research, at least right now, of course, is getting enough data to train your model. Even if you have a lot of data, more would probably be better. But in the scientific domain, low data scenarios are quite common. And in fact, we're usually interested in low data scenarios, right? Like, let's say I want a drug that can treat this disease, and maybe no one's ever, there no other drugs exist to do that right now. Um, so that's a very low data scenario. But kind of an idea here is we have all these different types of data. Can we connect them using language as a glue, essentially? So can we, for example, connect cellular pathways with the drugs that change how they work? As another kind of big application, or just sort of direction, I guess, um, if we want language models to understand the real world, we need to expose them to it. And so by using sort of this multimodal paradigm, we can help ground language models into external real world knowledge to improve understanding of unseen molecules, or to help the model justify maybe why it says we should have this hypothesis, etc. Um, as another key point, automation is a very interesting direction that people are starting to get very excited about. And so here, instruction following, dialogue capable, and tool equipped models can help us guide automated discovery, both in things like simulations, but also in robotic labs. And then these models can be used to help reason about and discover new chemical knowledge. And finally, language is really useful for enabling scientists without computational expertise to use all of these new advances in scientific AI. Yeah, so that's sort of the overall goal. And here I sort of have a slide on that. So I won't really go through the points again in detail, but really, I guess something I like to bring up is that humans have sort of developed language as our method to abstractly reason about the world. And so science has relied on natural phenomenon for a long time for innovation, whether it's the discovery of antibiotics, or kind of looking at, oh, well, birds can fly. How do we how do we do that? Even if the way we do it is maybe not the same. But we've kind of already created this natural linguistic phenomenon for abstraction and connection. And we have a lot of data for it. So we can use that to help us interface in a new way with like biochemistry. Okay, so how do we actually integrate these modalities now that we've sort of looked at all these sort of high-level directions and potential exciting applications and whatnot? So first of all, generally speaking, we like to kind of divide multimodal large language models for science into a couple categories. So the first is bioencoder models. So what does this mean? Well, essentially the key kind of idea here is we're doing a late fusion between the data. So we have separate encoders for each modality. So here we might have molecules in natural language, and then we sort of fuse that information very late. So essentially we're trying to align instead of really understand maybe interactions between the modalities. On the other hand, we have joint representation models where we are doing a much earlier fusion of those two data modalities. Um, and so this can be useful because it can allow a lot more fine-grained interaction. However, it's a lot more difficult to train. Biencoder models, you can use existing single modality models, and you generally need less data because you're doing a much later kind of fusion, I guess. And something not pictured in this slide that's, I think, worth bringing up at this point is that you can also enable like very general purpose large language models to interact with molecules using tools, and that's certainly a very interesting direction. Okay, so let's talk about biencoder models first. So for this, I'm going to generally use my paper text to mul as the framework, and then I'll talk a little bit about other applications that this type of model has been used for. So in this paper, we looked at molecule retrieval. So the idea here is, okay, if I have a description of a molecule, I want to be able to essentially retrieve that molecule from a database. So this is kind of, at least intuitively, seems tricky, right? Because we need to connect information into very different modalities. And so we look at the biencoder solution. So here, the idea is we want to create an aligned embedding space. So given sort of a natural language representation of a molecule and a structural representation of a molecule, we want to project them to be roughly the same in some latent space. So how do we do this? So we look at using a contrastive symmetric loss. Since I think a lot of people are familiar with the CLIP paper, you can think about this as being similar to that. But essentially, a kind of key idea is to compare the product of the molecule and text batch and to the identity matrix. So how does that, what is the idea there? Well, essentially, the idea is in a mini batch of size n, we're going to have n positive examples. But if we compare, for example, the second description with the first molecule, that gives us a negative. And we can do that across the whole mini batch. And this is pretty efficient in terms of taking advantage of all our data, right? Because we've essentially already done the bulk of our calculations in the encoders of the model, right? Either in encoding the text or encoding the molecule. So it's quite cheap to sort of create those negatives, and then so that gives us more kind of information from a single mini batch. Okay, so what have these sort of models been applied to? So I kind of discussed cross-modal retrieval, which was the initial task. So the way that looks is, okay, we have a description of the molecule and we would encode it into kind of a latent representation. And then we can use this with some sort of like approximate nearest neighbor search to search a database where the molecule representations have already been computed. But you can also integrate this into molecule and protein generation frameworks, into things like drug editing, assay activity prediction, etc. And I think in the interest of time, I'll probably skip describing some of those. So next we have joint molecule language models. So the idea here, right, is that we're kind of essentially taking these different modalities and feeding them all into the same large language model so that it's able to sort of better process like fine-grained interactions between the modalities, which might be necessary for improving understanding. So first, I wanted to mention KVPLM. So this is an encoder-only joint model, right? And essentially here we have kind of a mix of these different modalities going into that model. And it was used for tasks like molecule property prediction, NLP tasks like relation extraction, and things like cross-modal retrieval. But okay, what about creating new structures of text? And so this is from some work I did a couple years ago, but the idea here is, okay, how do we create the right molecule? And we proposed text-guided molecule generation. So text-to-image models, right, as we discussed, can kind of do a lot of really interesting things in terms of high-level ideas or functions. So can we do that with molecules too? And the idea, right, is generate a molecule which satisfies a given description. Um, so kind of, as we mentioned, data scarcity is a big potential issue. It was a bigger issue at the time. So kind of the question we asked is, can we treat this as a multilingual problem? And essentially the idea there is, okay, we have a lot of molecule data, we have a lot of text data. We're very limited in terms of associations between those two types of data. So we sort of adopt this multilingual pre-training approach where we pre-train on the molecule modality, right, using like a span corruption task. We pre-train at the same time on a text modality. So these are not connected, but we're training on them both at the same time. And the idea there, right, is to increase the model understanding of molecules um, without losing our ability to understand language. And then using kind of our limited cross-modal data, we're able to then do fine-tuning where we um, learn to do either text conditioned molecule generation or molecule captioning. Okay, so kind of what does this look like? So actually, I'll probably start with examples 2 and 3 here. So if you look at 2 and 3, you can see, okay, our proposed model is able to generate molecules which match the ground truth. And this makes sense because in these particular descriptions, we have structural information on the molecule. But really what's more interesting to look at is the first example, because you'll note that there's actually probably a lot of molecules we can generate given this description that would match this description. So you'll note that the only one that actually potentially matches the description is the output of our multi-5 model. However, it doesn't match the ground truth. And this is kind of a key challenge that this sort of brings up. So it's both very exciting because that ability to like generate molecules that match ambiguous descriptions is very cool and very a big reason we want to kind of use this methodology. But at the same time, it's really hard to tell when the model is right for ambiguous descriptions. Um, so something interesting you can also do with this kind of overall approach is say, like search for function. So you can say, okay, this molecule is a blue dye. What kind of structures do I get? This molecule displays anti-malarial properties. What kind of structures do I get? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the other direction, molecule captioning. And so kind of the reason we want to do this is there's an enormous number of possible molecules, and they all have an enormous number of properties. And some of these are not necessarily easy to measure, and we certainly can't test all of them in a lab. It would be tremendously expensive. So can we describe molecules at a high level using natural language in order to better understand their function, etc.? However, this is pretty hard. And a big reason for that is there's a lot of ways we can describe a molecule in terms of a formula or in terms of synthetic routes, in terms of the properties it has, in terms of like the applications, like, oh, okay, this is an antifungal, in terms of the functional groups and many other methods. Sort of in the figure on the right, you can see 5 different captions for this nice picture of a cat, which I took from a popular image captioning data set. But then if we look at the single caption we have for this molecule, we can see just looking at each sentence, they're very different. There's a lot more linguistic diversity. We have sentences talking about structural information. We have sentences talking about where the molecule came from when it was discovered. We have sentences talking about like its function, things like anti-neoplastic, etc. So yeah, a lot of diversity there. So how do we actually evaluate results? So kind of at least initially, as with most machine learning tasks, we need a ground truth, right? So one thing we can do is compare the ground truth and predicted text. Another thing is comparing the ground truth and predicted molecules. Something kind of new is we can compare across modalities, and we do propose a new metric for that in that work. And we can also say, is the molecule generated actually valid? And just as sort of like a side note, it's actually quite interesting to say, okay, if I keep asking our model for, let's say, antifungals and it keeps generating invalid molecules. Maybe it doesn't understand antifungals that well. But sort of a key point here, looking back at this work, is we used a lot of natural language generation metrics since people have been working on those for a long time. However, they're usually based on n-gram overlap or similar ideas, and um, they're not super useful in the case of molecule captioning because you can describe a molecule in so many ways. However, that's mostly what we used. Um, so as a way of trying to better address this evaluation challenge, we've been looking at other ways to evaluate captions. So here I'm going to kind of briefly talk about this work we did on building a data set for the Language Plus Molecules workshop at ACL earlier this year. So at this point in time, kind of a key kind of background information is that I would generally have categorized existing data sources as either being kind of small but high quality and scraped from somewhere like PubChem as being kind of lower quality but large scale by doing entity linking on the scientific literature or by doing a template-based conversion to natural language. Where you take a non-language task and then you convert it into a question in natural language, and then you can do this across thousands of tasks to really enable a lot of interesting multitask capabilities. But yeah, let's look at the data set. So kind of the key question we asked here is, okay, how can we evaluate how well molecule captioning models do at different properties, right? And in particular, we also wanted to focus on like key reasons we actually want to use natural language. And so again, this is sort of compositionality, functionality, and abstraction. So to do this, we collected abstract properties and functions in the form of natural language, kind of like things like, okay, this is an antiviral agent or things like that. And then what we did is we made these compositional by combining these properties together for each molecule. And here we took sort of that template-based approach. In particular, we focused on 4 kind of key categories of interest in the biomedical domain, in light and electricity, in kind of human interactions, so things like touch, taste, etc., and in terms of agriculture and industry. So we have about 200,000 molecules in this data set, but the idea, right, is, okay, given this molecule here at the top, let me turn on a pointer. Yeah, so it's both an Alzheimer's treatment and a inhibitor of that protein, and so we kind of composed them into the same caption. And so we made this shared task open for submissions. So overall, we saw a decent amount of improvement over kind of a baseline model. But kind of what's interesting is that different tasks have very different levels of performance. So kind of in the biomedical domain, we have considerably better performance than we did in human interaction or in agriculture and industry. So in its more specific properties with bad performance, we see things like pesticides or toxins where the models don't do very well. On the other hand, on things like interacting with certain proteins or kind of mentioning like associations with certain types of cancer or diseases, the models do much better. And they do well on combinations that were not seen during training. And so I'm going to move on to kind of a very recent preprint I've released. So here, what we did is we looked at doing kind of a comprehensive captioning benchmark on how well language can enhance molecule property prediction. So kind of a little bit of key background here is, okay, language models contain a vast amount of information from a mixed variety of sources. So how do we get the relevant information back out? So recent ideas in natural language processing involve using language models to improve themselves or other models, right? So we might give a language model multiple personalities and then have it talk to itself to improve its output. But really, at least from my perspective, the intuition here is we shoved the whole internet into a language model, but a lot of the internet is garbage. So how do we get the relevant information back out? So, okay, in the case of chemistry, what are we looking at. So we can, for example, give language models different personalities. Like we tell this one it's a helpful chemist, this one's a medicinal chemist, this one's a biologist, this one does quantum chemistry, and we say, okay, tell me about this molecule. What properties does it have? What functions does it have? So what do examples like from these general models look like, and also some specific ones? So for example, from Llama here, we get it suggesting, oh, maybe this is a kinase inhibitor. Llama 3.18b has a little bit too much safety guide rails put in place, doesn't want to synthesize this, it thinks it's illegal, even though it's not. We have domain-specific models. For example, BioT5 Plus also thinks this is related to tyrosine kinases. GPT-4o decides to look at all these functional groups. And so kind of the key question is, how do we use natural language to enhance existing molecule property prediction models? So sort of the key idea here is, okay, given kind of a description from all these molecules, how can we improve upon a graph neural network as opposed to, say, just representing a molecule in text? So essentially, what we do is we look at the error we get from these different models, and then we use that to rank the models. So this is one instance of a battle, essentially. And so we can actually feed these battles into the chess elo system to create ratings. And this essentially gives us a new way to evaluate molecular captions, which is grounded into the drug discovery process, although it's generally applicable to lots of different chemical domains. So this kind of taught us a few things. So captions generally do lead to improved performance, which kind of confirms earlier work. And this is dataset and task-specific variations. We found that domain-specific captioners were the best, but followed pretty closely by large-scale general-purpose language models. And again, there's variations in what they're good at. Different personalities essentially can benefit different tasks, and task-specific prompts do improve performance. And also battle-based ratings are useful both for combining different types of tasks like regression or classification, but it's also seems to be more robust and to comparing these different types of tasks, and it's kind of a complementary way of evaluating. Okay, so those are some kind of, that's kind of was the overall part of the talk. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about just recent trends that are kind of interesting and, in my opinion, ongoing. And then kind of my overall conclusion. So I'll try and go through this a little quickly since we're running out of time. So one kind of direction is just building better architectures to integrate molecular structure and text. Kind of basically the thing is, like early work on the problem was just like, can we apply these NLP techniques to molecules? But that doesn't mean that's like the optimal way to do that. And so we're starting to see more and more architecture switch to kind of more sophisticated integrations. Kind of as another kind of interesting direction, right? I think I'm alluded to this at some point is, can we train models to do molecular tasks in an instruction following way? So here we're in some sense doing multitask learning by learning on a lot of different tasks. And right now I'd say that overall the trend is to fine tune a model like Llama on as many tasks as you can convert to natural language, basically. But kind of as an interesting next step in this direction is saying, can we go from just following instructions to actually having a dialogue with a scientist, where a scientist might say, like, I need help figuring something out about this molecule, and we can go through steps. Okay, so then one kind of very interesting thing there, in my opinion, is doing like iterative optimization of molecules with human feedback, where the model continually tries to keep updating a molecule based on a human scientist. So how are these sort of instruction tuned models evaluated? Generally speaking, people have just sort of taken all these existing tasks and tried to convert them to a standardized benchmark like the MMLU. However, kind of a question that I ask is this really enough in AI for science? And I sort of mentioned some very recent work that I've been doing because of that question. As another trend, right? There's this idea of adding more modalities and more data types to um, models, right? And the idea is, okay, if we just have more background knowledge, we're going to have better models. Um, Another very interesting direction is just using language models as scientific agents for chemistry, right? So instead of teaching models to understand molecular structure, we'll just give them the tools to do so. And so this also has applications in just controlling automated laboratories. Um, Although, right, setting up hardware to do things like that can be a bottleneck from what I've seen. Um, Another kind of trend is connecting language models with computational feedback. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I think there was a talk given yesterday, probably focused a lot on this work. Um, yeah, so that's sort of um, everything I wanted to cover. Um, so to conclude, first of all, there's a number of remaining challenges, of course. Um, Kind of key things I focus on are things like grounding and factuality. How do we actually evaluate if what we're doing is useful? Um, there are problems, right, with inconsistency. And a key idea there is that the scientific literature is updated over time. That's how science works. But it presents challenges for training language models because it's not consistent and the model doesn't necessarily have a great way of figuring that out during the training process. Um, Similarly, the training process for language models doesn't do a great job of teaching the model how to understand, like, this was written 20 years before this, um, but also just understanding things like molecular dynamic simulations. How do things change over time? Um, as I mentioned, hallucination is quite useful for discovering new things, but we also need to control it so that we don't hallucinate when we don't want to. And really, I think something to focus on here is justifying what we've proposed, right? So if we hallucinate a new molecule, we need to be able to say why we think it's the best one, or like why it's really good. And then again, data always a problem in the scientific domain. So kind of what's next? So I think next, integrating these large language models into these automated systems or with simulations and just improving our applications is kind of a big direction, just because to me, these language models are almost like babies or something, and we need to build structures around them that make them useful. Um, Second is I think it's very interesting that there's this idea of using um, kind of the knowledge discovered by these AI models to help us learn fundamental things about chemistry, drug discovery, science, etc. So can we find let's say a new pattern in these models and then use it to discover a fundamental rule about the world? Um, Improving molecule language models. There's a lot of interesting work coming out in that direction, but you know, definitely improvements to be made there. And then, of course, getting better data. So as my kind of last slide, there's a lot of really exciting changes in the biochemical sciences that are kind of that are potentially going to happen because of integrating molecular structure of natural language, right? Abstract functional and compositional control of molecules, automation, discovering new knowledge from the scientific literature. However, there's certainly key challenges remaining, with evaluation and data scarcity being particularly notable. And as a vision for the future, I've talked about a lot of emerging directions, but how do we combine all of this into a robust system for molecular discovery, right? So how do we take a language model and teach it about molecular structure, give it the ability to talk with scientists and use tools? And how do we control hallucination? How can we have it interact with simulations and automated labs and things like that? All in a way that's actually useful. So yeah, I'd like to thank kind of my collaborators and various kind of affiliated institutions. And yeah, I'll go to questions now. Sorry, I